politics and locations, I've only visited Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Quebec.
East Coast.
East Coast guy.
East Coast, yeah, yeah. I have ambitions to get to BC, but haven't gotten there. Before I go on, is Rick Mercer still on TV in Canada?
Yeah, right.
Right. I enjoyed the articles about the stupid Americans who believe that you put the elderly out on ice floes and are reluctantly going to adopt the 60-minute hour. So, it's incredible that he gets the stupid Americans to say these stupid things because we don't pay attention to your culture and history. Well, I should say a little about my background. I was influenced a lot by this. I'm 60. How old am I? 62. So I grew up went to high school in the 1960s. I think in that era, at least my experience of growing up, and probably for particularly whites, both poor, working, and middle class, we believed our government was right, that our government told the truth, because we fought in World War II and we beat the Nazis and that kind of thing, because we don't pay attention to the role Russia played in World War II, but that's another question. But that we were always right. So when the Vietnam War came along, I initially, like most people in generation, said, well, we're fighting the communists, so we're on the right side. But just in that era, there was just more discussion about what was going on, and then you start to learn that, well, there's aspects of it that seem more like a civil war, or that Ho Chi Minh would have been elected president if there was an election. There was supposed to be an election held in 1956, and he would have been elected president because he was a nationalist hero from having fought the Japanese. But because he was going to win, he was a communist, we sort of canceled the election. So you learn things, and then obviously it was a traumatic period because every male had to think about the draft and what they were going to do or not do, and then every woman had lots of male friends and relatives and so forth, so it was an issue for everyone. So I think that was profound in terms of questioning authority and not believing your government. Like people who are younger than me in America, it's more like, yes, we don't expect our government to tell the truth. They lie in certain kinds of ways and are controlled by certain kind of powers. But if you grew up in a different way, it was a shift that you had to shift it was a challenge to your thinking and a transformation to go from believing to being skeptical. The other big influence on me that probably is why I'm in this room was the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King spoke in my hometown about a month before he was assassinated in 1968, and when he was assassinated, it really had a big impact on me. I heard on the radio that he was in Memphis standing with the Memphis sanitation workers who were on strike. So kind of in a little bit of a trance, I went out the next day in my neighborhood and asked for donations for the strike fund. And certainly got some probably strange looking looks from some of the people whose doors I knocked on. But I was in high school then, and we raised money for the strike fund, and about 10% of the community I lived in was African American. So I went to the what was called the Community Action Program, which was a creation of what was called the War on Poverty, that created these local, really community agencies to deliver the services that the federal government had decided were part of the War on Poverty. And in some areas they actually did certain amounts of community organizing, but it ended up being cut off at certain kind of point. But so got involved there, and we got people to go to what was called the Poor People's March, which was the last campaign Dr. King was working on. He was trying to move the civil rights movement into an economic justice movement. And they called it the Poor People's Campaign, that he was reaching across to try to involve Latinos and poor whites. Probably was most interesting, even though we were for a short time working on this national, was I discovered people in my hometown were working on a local issue of urban renewal, and the slang for urban renewal in the late 60s was Negro removal. Negro was the term that African Americans or blacks, that was still the common term there, or was transferring in that era to black. But basically this was a federal funds that was supposed to rebuild or renovate communities that were supposed to be deteriorated. But often you pushed out all the people who were there. And then probably within about half a mile of where we're sitting, there was a whole neighborhood called the West End. It was a dynamic urban ethnic neighborhood of Italians and Irish and Jews and blacks, but it was it's this close to downtown. So that was one of the areas they demolished the whole neighborhood, moved everyone out, promised them that they'd come back, but they built luxury housing. The mayor of Boston, assistant, won the development rights to build a luxury housing, and no one could afford to come back. So that was kind of like what urban renewal was. But fortunately, it sparked a movement in this community so that even though they intended to make half the rest of the city an urban renewal area, because of that experience, people actually organized and fought in incredible ways with really incredible numbers in other neighborhoods in succeeding years. But anyway, I got a touch of what you would call community organizing issues in 1968, and that made me, when I went to college, to kind of look for something like local. There were all kinds of causes that, I did work on anti-war issues too, because there was so much going on during that period from 65 to 75, but I consciously looked for some things in the neighborhood. Initially just service, what we call social service, but I followed around an organizer in what is called the Cambridge Model Cities area, and then I started working as a volunteer in a tenants' rights group in Dorchester in 1970, and moved to that community after my junior year in college, and then became a staff person for that tenants' rights group when I finished college. And I know some of you are doing tenant organizing today. So that's what got me into organizing. I still live in that. Dorchester is a working class section. It's the largest neighborhood of Boston. There's about 140,000 people. When I first moved there, it was 2/3 Irish Catholic working class and about 1/3 African American. Today it's about 1/3 African American, 1/3 immigrants from Vietnam, Haiti, Cape Verde Islands, Dominican Republic, and 1/3 Irish Catholic. So I'm still there, but I now work with a network of organizations around the state. So I don't, organize around the state, not just in that neighborhood I live in. But in the 70s, I worked in that neighborhood, first doing the tenants' rights organizing, and then we turned our group into what we would call the multi-issue neighborhood organizing group. Though in the earlier period, we had a welfare rights chapter, so I was doing some of that at the same time Wade was doing that in Massachusetts. And that neighborhood organizing group became working with some colleagues of Wade's who had worked in welfare rights, like Lee Staples, who you met, and Mark and Barbara Splain, and Jim Katz. We merged our neighborhood improvement organization in Dorchester into some things that they were doing to form a statewide organization called Mass Fair Share, which you heard about some from Lee. And that became an organizing network over time called the Citizen Action Network. It was a form of organizing groups around the country that still exists, though I don't think not as strong as it was maybe in the 70s and 80s. So I did that work in the 70s. In the 80s, I directed 2 issue organizing groups, the Massachusetts Tenants Organization, a statewide tenants' rights organizing group, and the Massachusetts Affordable Housing Alliance, which organized around affordable homeownership and discrimination in lending, and organized using a law that we had been part of with a lot of groups in helping to organize to pass in the 1970s, called the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, which I think in America is one of the more unique things, because it sort of forced a part of the private sector to have to, in a sense, it gave you levers to get banks to deal and negotiate with you on certain ways, and in the ways that I think other parts of the economy, we didn't have the levers, except sometimes with the utilities that were also regulated by the state. But other areas of the economy, you don't have a lever like that. Because of the amalgamation of the banking industry into really a national industry, that tool over time became less useful, but it was very useful in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s as a lever that could give you a way to force banks to negotiate and make certain kinds of reinvestment agreements that they wouldn't have want to make. So we were able to get them to agree to what we called an affordable mortgage program, and that's enabled over the last how many years? 20 years, about 15,000 people, predominantly people of color, in Boston to buy homes that they couldn't have bought otherwise without that type of original CRA agreement. So that's what I did in the 80s. In the 1990s, I made a decision to work in what's called, you've heard about faith-based community organization or congregation-based community organizing, and I made that decision because I had paid attention to the growth of those kinds of organizations. I thought that they went further than we had gone in terms of the amount of time they spent on training. When I did organizing, if we had like a half-a-day training on a Saturday, it was kind of like a big deal. And those organizations had developed a culture where they had 5 or 6 day trainings that leaders would go to, and more training, and also seemed, not that issue organizing groups didn't have turnouts and some significant turnouts in some places, but it seemed like some of those groups had significantly larger amounts of people than we were getting because of the institutional membership and what could be done there. So we made a decision, I made a decision to shift focus from what would be called issue organizing around particular issues and organizing people generally more as individuals or sometimes out of organizations but not congregations, to shift into that. So since then I've been involved in working to create 6 organizations in Massachusetts cities that are that style of organizing, and 1 in Vermont. So I did that kind of organizing really since 1990. Part of the time we were part of the IAF between 1996 and 2002, and then for various reasons left that, and then about 3 or 4 years later became part of the PICO National Network, which we're still involved with. There are 4 faith-based networks: PICO National Network, the Industrial Areas Foundation, Gamaliel, and another group called DART, which is DART is a little bit less national. They're more in Florida and the Midwest. So that's some of my background. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what's different and what's the same in organizing, but I wanted to stop here and see in case you had some questions about anything I said or didn't say about these periods of time.
I don't know how much you want to get into it. I was always curious about the IAF, and so complications, you touched on that, and why is it better? Why do you think it was better for your group or for the members, or however you want to say it, to be
as compared to other networks?
Yeah, like why'd you leave?
Well, it's a long story, but the IAF started faith-based organizing in America. It was basically, the IAF had a long history, started by Saul Alinsky in 1939, organizing the Back of the Yards Council in a neighborhood in Chicago where the stockyards are, and the book called The Jungle, which is a famous book written in 1905 about that same neighborhood. That's where it started, and there were various organizations Alinsky organized, but they weren't a huge number if you total them up when he died in 1972. But he was an author and a very, very charismatic public speaker, so he had a wide reputation. But on paper, it wasn't a huge number of organizations. And his successor, Ed Chambers, was much more of a, conscious about implementing and training and developing the institute they had into that. And Chambers had been one of the organizers who organized one of their successful groups in Rochester called the FIGHT organization. It's a great name, FIGHT, and it stood for, in that era, Freedom, Integration, God, Honor, Today. But Ernie Cortez, who was an organizer for the IAF in that period, basically went back to San Antonio, where he grew up in the, you may know more about this history than me, but my memory is he went back to San Antonio, where he grew up after organizing with the IAF for, I don't remember how many years, 3 to 5 years, and basically kind of rethought the organizing, which up to then had been basically block associations, civic groups, sometimes churches, but not
parish councils,
not focused on churches. And he rethought it as like, could we base an organization in the church, in the religious congregations, and could we go a lot deeper to form committees in each church, and that they would do listening sessions into each church such that they would have the capacity to develop leaders in each church and bring forward significant numbers of parishioners, because some of these Latino, Mexican-American parishes in San Antonio, could have several thousand members each parish, and there were many parishes in one city. And he built an organization called COPS, Communities Organized for Public Service, and it developed, a number of significant local victories, and then he was able to spread the organizing throughout Texas and win some significant things that, on a statewide basis, and that's how and then they replicated that kind of organizing model in other parts of the country. And the other three networks really borrowed from them. There were two former IAF person, Jose Carrasco, helped the PICO network, which was which was using a neighborhood organizing style. He helped them to understand this, and they made a change. Oakland, California, they had a kind of a good version of that group, and their largest turnout in neighborhood organizing was, 400 people, and then they did this parish organizing in one large parish in Oakland, one church, and they got 600 people to the action. So, what's going on here? So, and then another former IAF person, I'm forgetting his name, but for a second, but anyway, helped the Gamaliel people really understand, and they developed the same thing. And the DART people, I don't know, because John Calkins was a welfare rights organizer, but they must have had someone who helped them with that thinking in part.
Yeah, I don't remember what the origin story is. He went down to Miami. They were still working in Ohio, and
right.
I think they just all sort of, much as you're saying, ended up going that way. It wasn't the most complicated model.
Right. I think the reason we were originally independent as we were doing this work in the early 90s, the reason we went with the IAF originally was that they were more present in the East. PICO was more of a Western United States at that time, even though we talked to them and we talked to Gamaliel, and we just thought we'd probably have more contact and relationship and help if we went with the IAF. That was our original. It worked out, it's probably too long to tell this story, but for what you're looking to learn, but basically, the organizer who I work with in the IAF, a man named Jim Drake, he was the first staff person with the United Farm Workers, working with Cesar Chavez, and worked with him for 16 years to build the union. Then he built a group in Mississippi with the pulpwood workers, and then he went and worked with the IAF in Texas. So, as Jim reminded me, I have not spent my life in the IAF, so he was a little bit different in terms of, there are a number of different kinds of ways to organize. So he actually we worked together to form the IAF affiliate in Boston. In any other area of the country, the IAF would never have worked with another organizer who wasn't part of their network, because it wasn't the way they did things, and they generally didn't think that anyone else who wasn't in their network knew how to organize very well. So why would they work with them? That was their attitude. It's complicated, but when Jim died, the people who were present in the IAF, I wasn't out of their culture and background, so I wasn't a good fit, and in certain kinds of ways they were able to maneuver and push, so that I at a certain point decided to leave. So it's a longer and more complicated story, but a different.
I think you've done more than a good job on it. Yeah.
It's a difficult thing when you work your heart out for a group for 6 or 7 years, and then you're gone and can't count on them for anything, even though we're in the same territory. But so it happens. But they have some brilliant people, good strategists. They built some really good organizations, but to a certain point, they could have a little bit more humility. And what's ironic, everybody always expected them to be the first network to work on national issues because they were so political and so. But because of personality, they're political, but they're really personality conflicts between 3 people in the IAF. They don't work on national issues. There's really 2 IAFs: Western America IAF run by Ernie Cortez, and Eastern America IAF run by Mike Eakin and Arnie Graff. So that's a little bit ironic. PICO has been a better fit for me. There's a little bit different. PICO really takes, probably language is important. The first words in PICO tend to be around relationship and values, and the first words in IAF and also in Gamaliel are around power and politics. And it's not that PICO people don't talk about politics and power, but it's sort of important. What are the first words that sort of you talk about as you describe yourself? So faith, values, and why we're doing things based on our faith, and clergy involvement where it can be is really important in PICO. And in the IAF, it was more. IAF even would use, even though the IAF was primarily made up of religious congregations. The organization they would always describe generically, we're a broad-based organization. They use that term. We're not a faith-based community improvement organization, which is what PICO would describe itself as. Even though they are primarily religious congregations, they would still say we're a broad-based organization because it's more of a political framework to them. Not that you could go to a meeting if you didn't know who was in what network. You could go to a meeting sometimes of any network and not completely know what network it is, because there's some things that are very similar, but there are some things that are different because of the sort of cultures that get built up as people are in separate places over periods of time. It is a sad thing that the networks don't work together very much, and there's rivalry, and sometimes there's competition in geographic areas because no network is powerful. We wouldn't be powerful enough, all four, to work nationally, but obviously you could get more done if there were all four, and if all four were working together, there'd be more relationships with other issue groups and labor groups. Not that there isn't some of that, but it's all kind of spread out, so it's a little bit sad. How would you say? Someone once said, even I think it was in some in the IAF, but I'm not sure if they absorbed it that way, that power is, what's the word? We give away our power more than it's taken from us, meaning by being disorganizing, we're giving away our power, and there's not even it isn't like U.S. Steel came in and said you can't talk to each other. We're not talking to each other, in a sense. So I think, but each group's got to find their way toward forward, and I think PICO certainly is proud. It has pride and thinks about their interests, but has made some efforts more than I've experienced in other networks to try to work with other people, and also to be respectful that there are other kinds of organizing that can work as well as PICO organizing, whereas the IF, the general attitude is we're the only ones who know how to organize. So, it's a long answer, but there were other questions?
No.
Good.
I was just curious, I mean, because to be honest, in Canada, as far as I know, I mean, we certainly have nowhere near the number of organizations doing this kind of work, or really very many at all. But I mean, from your perspective, in terms of like overcoming those rivalries that kind of push these organizations apart, I mean, how do you think you would address that, or how do you think it should be addressed?
I think you be open. You just try to maintain relationships that you can, where you can talk to people, and show openness to it, but not assume it's possible. So you do try to just work with those who you can work. So PICO, some areas is working with unions, and some areas it's working with groups like the United We Dream. The young people are working for citizenship. So you try to show that you're open to working with other groups and enter into alliances where you can, and then just try to act responsibly when you're dealing with other networks if there's competition and so forth, to not badmouth and so forth and things like that. But there are limits because of the history of and the cultures that networks create that mitigate against this.
Here's the history in the U.S. ACORN in the U.S. over the last 10 years, certainly that I was there, had strong working relationships with Gamaliel, PICO, and DART. Participants were part of the Organizers Forum board, participated in that, and city to city there were some joint projects, San Diego with Gamaliel, and certainly we worked closely with PICO in California, where it was without a doubt much stronger than even ACORN had 13 offices in California, but where they had a base, particularly in Central California, was very deep, very strong. So in any statewide issue, there was joint efforts with PICO and education and a number of other projects. The IAF is the only one of the networks that was ever, just sort of not worth the lift. I mean, it wasn't, we could work with the odd occasional organizer and the odd person from, you know, Valley Interfaith might show up at an organizers forum trip to, you know, South Africa or something, but it was, you know, there were no institutional relationships. And although we could have conversations with, you know, an Arnie Graff or whatever, we never could build relationship. Usually we were able to work with most of the faith-based organizations just because it wasn't competitive. Our base was low to moderate income, it was a membership model, it was not a faith-based model, so although we worked with a number of churches, it was never a matter of us putting together our 35 churches versus their 35 churches and having to compete with CHD money. I mean, this was, so to the degree it was over time, certainly in the first 20 years of ACORN, you couldn't have imagined working together closely in many areas, but over the second 18 that I was there, you could work. Eventually, you know, as everybody got older and calmer and whatever, you just realized, well, there's no competition here, you can do business. Except in the IAF, when that's more of a, you know, I don't want to say country club, but it's more of an exclusive club that they want to control the membership of, and it's not based on external kinds of criteria, and that's fine. You know, it's not like this isn't a small country, even in this work, so it's not like you don't know all the IAF organizers over time, but it's just, you know, life goes on and there's plenty of work. You don't really think every day, gee, I wonder what they're doing, because really, we're nowhere close to taking power, so we're not having to really, you know, divide up the jobs and who gets to run which bureaus of government. So we never really sort of left the IAF off the list because we were about to, you know, take over the world. So it's just, they're busy, we're busy, everybody's busy, and frankly, you could be in the same city and never run into the IAF organizers for decades. I mean, you know, that's strange. Right. Because anywhere else you run into, you know, everybody, and there are all these sort of cross links. But that's sort of the short tail of the United States, and you know, luckily you're still more in Canada. You're more in the position of where the IAF was, certainly for, you know, some years under Saul. I mean, where you're a little bit. There aren't 50 different kinds of community organizations. There's y'all, and then,
Wide open.
It's monopoly capitalism, which is always subject to both, you know, huge advantages and huge potential for abuse. So.
But the IAF maybe in Edmonton, did we?
And we understand they're in Edmonton.
Vancouver. They're trying,
and the London Citizens model, Neil Jameson and them, and that's, you know, it's not like we don't know Neil from over there, and he's reached out on how to do living wage campaigns when they were doing them, you know, so he didn't get the IAF code book that said don't talk to us or whatever, so it's all friendly.
Right.
Back to you.
Let me ask you a question though. The NDP has a chance to take over the BC provincial government, that Wade said. So how close are they to what you're doing in BC?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Are they like similar, or are they like a part of the equivalent of, like, are they like the Democratic Party? Or what are they like compared to your issues and your folks?
I think they'd be more our kind of folks than I think the Democrats would be. But there's two main parties there. The Liberals, which is a coalition of I think a lot of people would say, you know, a coalition of the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States come together. Yep. You know, right-wing Democrats, or, you know, liberals and conservatives came together. And then there's the NDP, which has always come out of Labor. You know, I think they've changed the structure a bit around where Labor doesn't control them anymore. But yeah, so we're looking at it. They're at 48% in the polls. There's a new part. Well, the Conservative Party's making a comeback, so a bit of division on the right. Anyway, so it looks like they will win unless something crazy happens. And then our kind of fight, which me and Scott have been figuring out, is how to make it so that they pick up our platform. When they were so high in the polls, we were worried that what do they need anyone for? They got 50%. Everyone else is at 18, or you know, so.
So our project is how to leverage our top 3 or 4 issues into some way that we can, you know, force some commitments if they end up running government in BC.
But with your experience, wouldn't you say that's significantly better or different than America? That because there's no state government in America that we would think is overly
I wish you
overly
were-
progressive.
I wish you
what,
were more
what am I
diff-
missing? What am I missing though?
I wish it were more different than we would like it to be, but unfortunately, I don't know. John, you should probably answer this more, but it's still push and shove.
It's still
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
We've never worked with an NDP government anywhere in Canada, so.
It was really interesting to talk to the people in Nova Scotia where the NDP did take power there. And although we didn't have great discussions with, we weren't there very long, but they're pissed at the NDP. They felt like pushed out. Labor's irate at them, and like it's gonna, according to the people that we talked to, it's gonna cause the demise of the party, and there's no way they're gonna win the next election. According to the Labor Council that I talked to, and according to the NSGU union people
I
that I
think we're
talked
smarter
to.
than Labour.
They would-
I think we're just
we're
more
smarter than Labor too. I'm just
so-
telling you what I heard in Nova Scotia.
And we
NDP 's
just started
NDP 's
working
different.
over the last year in Nova Scotia with it.
Yeah, we weren't working with them at all. This is just what they did to the sector.
But any political party is going to have some different interest than we have.
Right.
And that's, one of the things that's so interesting about so many of these organizers forum things. We were just in Bolivia, and Alex was down there. ACORN Canada sends one person every year. You have these huge social movements in some of these countries, and very left, committed, social democratic. You'd think, finally we're going to see what Eureka really looks like. It's
Mm-hmm.
and you get down there, you talk to organizations that are similar to us, and it's like the Trail of Tears. I mean, it's sort of, well, when's the last time you talked to Evo Morales? Well, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I used to, we were part of the same social movement, and the Cochabamba water wars or gas wars or whatever, and he goes his way, consolidating government, trying to resist pressure from social movements. We're still building social movements, so
Yep.
and it's the mistake made in the first couple of years by progressives with the Obama government,
Mhm.
to think that somehow he's going to carry your ball as opposed to
Right.
We're gonna be fighting and we're just figuring out how.
Yeah.
we've
No.
got to.
No.
We're
that's
trying to
It's
get
gonna be
position.
more fun fighting now.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Fighting
Yes.
those
Yeah.
others.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of obviously it's better that he won than Romney won, but there was this, we all knew this, but there was just this series in the Boston Globe that ran earlier this week of the immigration prisons, and then just the horror story of just hundreds of thousands of people going through these things where they have really no rights, and their families don't know where they are, and they're shipped around the country, and people die because they don't get medications. And you just there's this story in America, like this novel called Rip Van Winkle, about this person who goes to sleep and he wakes up 30 years later. So it's almost like if I went to sleep 4 years ago and didn't know who got elected president, and I read that story, I would say, geez, these fucking Republicans, and look what they're doing.
Let's elect somebody for president.
And it's not that it would be a lot worse with Romney, but it's still like, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, excuse me. But
That's part of the faith organizing tradition. You get to say that. You don't get to say that much in Canada, but yeah.
so, other questions or reactions?
No,
I wanted to, that one thing, I don't know if it's how, I wanted to think about, I wrote down a list of sort of what's changed, seems to have changed maybe in the last 20 years here, and what still seems the same. I mean, and this, I don't know how, this is sort of a traditional framework in America, but I just wonder if it's true. We talk about here in America that there was a social contract between 1945 and 1980, that if you worked hard, you could have a good job and would have health benefits and pension and job security. And not all, but a substantial number of people, particularly the white working class, but even some parts of people of color, were part of that, and that sort of really just started to dissolve in 1980. So now, no job is secure. Many we may be getting national health care, but most people don't have health care. Pensions either are declining or being lost. So it's just that whole social contract is frayed due to primarily the power of corporations and also other effects like globalization and so forth. But that's general framework that people think about in America, but is it, do you have a similar or a different framework of what's happened in Canada since World War II?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the stats say that it was getting better and better until about the mid-70s, and it's been slowly getting worse since then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Really expedited by the free trade agreements
Yeah.
and the 95 liberal budget.
Yeah,
Yeah, the gap is
federally.
definitely growing over the past like 30 years.
The what?
That gap is
Right.
definitely growing for sure.
What part of the private sector in Canada is unionized?
What percentage?
Yeah,
Not much.
It's higher than America, but
we have 7% private and 10.
So it's gone from, when we first started working in Canada, it
Well,
was
that's everything,
34,
isn't it?
30, you know, 34%. Now it's down to 20 something, 26 or 27. So it's unfortunately going exactly the same way, and the private sector is hollowing out. It's
Right. But that's still,
It's the
ours
same
went from
trends.
30, you know,
Yeah.
the 1975 it was 30 to 35%, and now it's 7% private. Yeah, a lot of public sector might bring it up to whatever 10 or 11% of all workers, but the private sector is it's below 7% probably now.
people believe we're going to 5%,
Right.
you know, fairly quickly, and with stuff like
Right.
what happened in Michigan, it'll be even faster.
Right.
But you know, for years we've been Cassandraing up there in Canada. You don't want to be like the United States. Now, unfortunately, you know,
Right.
we have
Yeah.
these meetings with our union allies, the steel and whatever, about different projects, and they are like the United States. So.
Well, yeah, like in Ontario, there's likely gonna be an election in March or April, and the Liberals are tanking, so the Conservatives could get a minority government, and they're talking like right-to-work legislation.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Well, John, you've written about right-to-work legislation for social policy, and where?
Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, Ontario, and then the federal government, they're up to something.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
up
they
to
could,
something.
that's some
Right.
shady.
This week.
Our columnist from the
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's not, we're not in a favorable light.
Yeah.
It's one big continent, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. No, it's amazing. America. I mean, the most important sort of event in labor history in the 30s happened in Flint, Michigan, and the auto workers were built, and now, you know, it's a right to work state, and the governor was brazen enough. Well, you know, only 17% belong to unions, so it's not a big deal. Let's move on. And there was and America has this individualistic culture. You know, individualistic liberty is a very strong strain in American life. There was a Ford worker I heard quoted on, like, yeah, we should get the right to decide whether we want to be in a union or pay union jobs or not. And, you know, like, you could see someone saying that, like, they stand right now and they think what they're going to think. And then I'm thinking about this history that their whole union was formed because people had to really fight these incredible corporations and who had vast private security forces who beat up the union organizers and leaders, and that's why this guy has the wages he has. But it's all, you know, he still approaches it without any sense of that history. So, like, what have you done for me lately? Or I just want to have the right to do whatever I want.
My understanding too is that just like looking at some of the freedom to work ads and all that it was like really grossly misrepresented in terms of the fact that, like, basically denying people jobs based on not wanting to join a union has been illegal there for quite a while. So that's not what it was about. It was about you know, people wanting the right to freeload, basically,
Right.
to get the benefits of the union without, you know,
Right.
paying the dues.
Right. So that's the union density is the big issue, the globalization. The other thing, as companies have become, in our city, this city, Boston, used to have a power structure called the Vault, and it got this nickname because they actually met in the vault of a bank in the 1960s. But there's a whole set of companies, like the phone company used to be a major corporation state by state, you know. But now the phone, you know, I don't know, there's 3 or 4. Verizon is I don't even know how much they cover in eastern, you know, part of America, but they're in 10 or 15 states, as opposed to we have one significant phone company that's Massachusetts. So instead of having the CEO of that corporation based in Boston and both wanting to control things but also having some civic interests, you have some area vice president who has less much less power. So the corporate structure changes, that you have less sort of major companies that are actually sort of run out of a particular major cities than they used to be, and then it just changes sort of like, you know, a number of different things that affects
Changes the
organization.
accessibility of the targets too,
Yeah.
which is very painful.
Right, right, right. And the number of times the names of your bank has changed because of mergers and acquisitions of bad banks. All the things around social media and computers and vans and robocalls that we use or are used on us is different. I think the unions and community groups are less separated. When we were doing organizing in the 70s and 80s, there weren't any community organizers kinds of persons in unions. It was a whole different world of, you know, working class people who came out of that movement, and community organizing was a different world. Both middle class and working class people, a lot of whom had gone to college but were in community organizations, and now you have a union. You have like someone like Mike Gallagher, who in the 70s and 80s was a community organizer, well, the 70s, and no one in unions was like him, and now he and a generation like him are, you know, leading a major union like this. So that's a big shift, that the separation between unions and community organizations is much less than it used to be, in terms of the kinds of people and the relationships they can have. Unfortunately, though, since the unions are, in a sense, much less strong, they're on the defensive, and, you know, they're fighting, you know, this right to work thing and the stuff they did in Wisconsin. You know, they see their ship going down because they're not increasing their membership, and their dues base is being intentionally destroyed by these intentional strategies of the companies to, make in a sense destroy their dues base, which means they can't organize as well, and they can't donate money to Democratic candidates and so forth. So that's big. The other thing is, I think, what I would call civic engagement, political organizing. Community groups is much bigger. ACORN used to do that the most of. There was an era where ACORN really was the only community organization, I would say, that did that systematically, and other community organizations would say, we work on issues, but we don't work on elections. And now there's a much greater part of the field that's where they may still not endorse candidates, but they're doing voter education, voter turnout, get out the vote. And then even some of them are setting up, not insignificant, setting up C4s and doing more with candidates. So that's shifted within community organizing. It used to be that's not part of community organizing in any traditional sense for a long time, and that's changed. ACORN really was, I think, the first ones who moved in that way significantly, but now more groups have done that in America. Obviously, immigration changes the whole picture. Like I said, my neighborhood in 1970 was 5% immigrants, and now it's 35% immigrants. And my neighborhood in 1970 was extremely tense because it was blacks and whites and race relations and so forth. And now when you have a whole significant group of immigrants of different backgrounds, it just changes the whole dynamics, and they bring a whole set of their history and culture and so forth, but they don't bring a viewpoint of the whites as being their specific oppressors, that they weren't their oppressors in El Salvador. So there's just a whole different kind of dynamic than there was because of the amount of immigrants who are in, not insignificant numbers in, a good number of states. And even now places like Georgia, who had no immigrants 10 years ago, have, 10%, 5 or 10% of Georgia is immigrants or something. So that's big. Federal money is gone. It's really gone in America. There's no money for cities. I mean, it was cut during Reagan, but there was still money. Some money came back under Clinton, but it's really gone. You're hearing about this cliff thing. Even the best deal possible for the Democrats, this still means no federal money. It's gone. So you don't even think of that equation. You used to have a dynamic where you thought about what's our, menu of places we could organize and impact and so forth, and that's, for money, the federal government is gone. Obviously, everyone in America is focused, not everyone, a lot of organizing groups and unions are focused on this window of the next 6 months that there could be a chance to win national immigration reform citizenship, and that's a real opportunity that would mean a lot in terms of the politics and economics of our country, but that's not good. That would be a lot, very important, but there's not going to be any more no federal money will be available as long as the Republicans control the House, and even, you know, there's other problems too, but as long as they control the House, there'll continue to be no federal money.
Where did the federal money go? What do you, I didn't read the Cliff article, but is it that they reduce the taxes, or they are financing a debt, or they spend it all in the military, or roads?
Probably a lot of those things. The military, there's been cuts, you know, combination of cuts and a lot of the military expanding the wars, and there's just been, you know, chipping away a lot of just programs have gotten smaller and smaller. And then just the costs, some of the fixed costs of some of the safety net programs, you know, in healthcare, Medicaid, and so forth, also, you know, are significant baby boomers that are, you know,
federal.
right, Social Security, Medicaid, which is both poor people's health care, but also elderly people's health care who run out of savings.
And money that goes from the federal government and block grants to the states is now controlled by the states. Increasing number of state legislatures are Republican controlled, so you have a restrictive allocation process in terms of our kinds of issues, or money going from them to the cities. I mean, all that's changed since the early 70s, you know, sort of systematically. But you can have situations like Louisiana where even under this Obamacare health care plan, the first 3 years are largely paid by the federal government, but the state's now controlled by Republicans, so 400,000 people won't be covered under health care because they don't want to participate in the federal program, even at free money, because they're afraid that after 3 years they'll still have to pay something. You know, it's a very difficult, polarizing, mean-spirited kind of world that we're working in here in the lower part of the continent.
And the religious, even though the groups we work with are members of religious congregations, that there's been a decline in religious membership in American life. What are called the mainline Protestant churches, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the United Church of Christ, Presbyterians are all declining in membership. The Catholic Church is declining among non-immigrants, also is similar to the mainline Protestants. And you know, a generation ago, you know, it was a sin if you didn't go to Mass. And these Catholic churches, like I'm in a neighborhood where every 10 blocks there's a Catholic church and a Catholic parochial school, and it was people's social life, and they sent their kids to school, and there were Catholic hospitals, and there was a whole entity, and it's all, the schools are closed. A large number of them are closed because they can't, you know, there's not any more nuns who would work at sub-minimum wages, so they economically can't keep them up. And the membership, other than immigrants, is taking a similar view that mainline Protestants, that the church attendance is voluntary, and it may fall back to nothing, or if I go on Christmas, or if I have a life baptism, or a funeral. So it's much more. So the immigrants, this generation of immigrants, are still involved in their churches, and Pentecostal churches among immigrants and blacks have grown, and evangelical churches among whites are you know, have grown in some areas too. But the places where our organizations organized, which were Catholic churches and mainline Protestant churches, it's really a declining membership. The Catholic Church was also much injured by the clergy sexual abuse in terms of the trust issues. So we face a crisis with groups like PICO of needing to rethink, and we, you know, so we think about organizing parents as units to be members. We think about more about alliances and coalitions, because we work harder to think about evangelical and Pentecostal churches that didn't naturally connect to these groups. We think harder about ways that we could think about and form relationships, even though those churches are not is likely to or is open to this. So we face a crisis because of that changing situation of religious life in America too.
Well, there are also political divisions within the church.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
CHD is certainly, you know,
Right.
not the factor it was
Right.
30, 40 years ago.
Right. The American bishops spend the most time on against gay marriage and against abortion, pro-life. There used to be a set of Catholics who believed in what was called the seamless garment, that meant you were pro-life, but you were against poverty, you were against war, you were against the death penalty. But all that has been made. The only thing that they still that's progressive talk about is immigration. They are pro-immigration rights, and they do something on that. But that's all, and it's still number 3 after pro-life and against gay marriage is number 3 on their list of.
That's probably, is that affecting, like, I'm not sure how, excuse me for my ignorance, but how you're funded, how these go with membership?
There is a funding source that Wade mentioned called Catholic Campaign for Human Development that groups get organizing grants from, but they're they put a lot of conditions. They put some conditions on grants which aren't. I mean, the things you'd really do, but there's a group in this a good neighborhood organizing group called the Chelsea Collaborative that's run by Latino immigrants, and
What Lee was talking about this morning. Lee must do some kind of volunteer
Yeah.
work or something.
And they got funding from this, but I think a cousin of the director's Latino woman is gay, and they did something, I don't know, signed something that included some aspect of gay rights and some maybe related to immigrants and so forth, and the National Catholic Campaign for Human Development, the funding source, says you can't do that. So they said, okay, we won't take the grant anymore. So it's kind of like a watershed kind of thing. But it's more the money is a question, but it's more that the parishes aren't as strong as they used to be. As a part of people's lives and as places to organize. The immigrant parishes are still significant, but the working class Catholic parishes are smaller in membership and smaller in the amounts of time people are involved in their churches. So that's significant in terms of if that's where you see as a significant part of your organizing base, then you got to think about, well, we're also, it's kind of like the equivalent of the decline in the labor movement. We have a decline in the places where we were organizing people out of churches, so we have to figure out what do you do differently.
Well, it's very like the decline in the labor movement. I mean, it's this whole shrinking of confidence in any institutions that involve collective life. So that's a fairly generalized crisis in our work.
I mean, some of the things that seem the same are more general, but I think there's the same anger and injustice and reaction to disrespect. I mean, look at the chord that the 99% and 1%, and even just as much as the Occupy movement, there's a certain band of people who sort of said, oh, what do they stand for? They don't have a message and all that, but like, okay, but they got something to the forefront of American life, at least a conversation that resonated, because that's where people were feeling, but there wasn't a way to express that nationally. And that even who knows what it'll do, but even the backbone that Obama is showing about not giving up on taxing the rich, at least in this current period, is connected to all that. So that kind of, it's just really sometimes to the leadership and the organizing groups, in a sense, give it a chance to what people have in their gut to sort of like be recognized. It's not like it isn't there still today as it was in those other periods, and people's willingness to act if they feel confidence in something. Their willingness to act and sacrifice and take risks is I think is present now as it was in other periods. I think personal relationships are still as important in terms of the kinds of relationships you have that lead to glue in organizations and lead to the ability for people to act and do things together. And even though we're covered by emails and Twitters and all that stuff, that's a flow of information, and it creates things as well as creates distractions, but I still think it's still largely around personal relationships. But sometimes some of those things creatively can organize your contacts more. Sometimes it brings disconnected people into kinds of things that to add voice to things that you might be organizing too. It's really a shortage. I think the cliche is there's not a shortage of issues, but there is a shortage of enough leaders, and that's our job to do our part in trying to develop leaders. So I don't think that's changed. I think the organizers and leaders' roles well, maybe that's, yeah, that's really something that's changed. And originally in organizing, there was a real fixed language about organizers. You know, their role is to prepare leaders for meetings and to do outreach, but they can't speak at meetings. They can't ever be quoted in the media, and the leaders have to lead everything in public and so forth. I think that line is a little bit fuzzier in community organizing. It's still primarily the line, but it's a little bit fuzzier. And it's interesting in unions. There in America, there isn't that distinction. The union president is a paid leader. You know, in a community organization, the president is a volunteer leader. But in community organizing, there was that sort of difference in community organizing versus union organizing, and it's still sort of the same, but I think there's a little bit more that I think organizers, there's more of a conversation about we have a leadership role in organizations. We still have to judge, and people are paying us to think about things and not just to say do whatever you want, but to pay us to think about options, and that we're not going to, you know, some God is not going to come, Saul Alinsky or someone is not going to come out of the heaven or hell and strike us dead if we are quoted in the newspaper. But obviously, at the bottom line, you still judge, do you have real leaders who make decisions? So it's not like if you're in the paper, that's the end of the world, but the bottom line is, are there real leaders? Can you turn out people? Are people making decisions? That's still the bottom line. So those are some things that I try to think about, the same and different. So there's probably things just talk about issue. I think the other thing is work, that up to a certain point, and I think your work, I think ACORN moved maybe more into this sooner, but there was a certain kind of sense that community organizing was, we were dealing with, originally we were dealing with people's neighborhood life. So schools, housing, public safety, healthcare, that was the province of community organizing, and work was the job of unions. And there was this but now, because unions have become weaker, I think community organizations now think that they have to be responsible for the wage gap and even efforts to get more training and all that, because we can't just, the labor unions, even though they'd want to do it all, they're not powerful enough. So we're not powerful enough either, but that has to be on our plate. We have to think of strategies. So our organization has come to a point, but that's the top issue our leaders is picked is jobs. So our campaigns, even though we do some other things, that's our top, is about, our goal next year is to be active part of building a campaign to raise the minimum wage, and to do something around funding for job training. So those are, and try to think about other kind of things. So that's definitely a switch. And also is daunting, because, it's someone, I've been in this a long time, but I find it more daunting. Like if it's about housing or education or healthcare, so forth, I kind of feel either I know what the best practices are, or I know who to call who knows. Whereas, I might be missing something, but on organizing on jobs and wages and so forth, there are definitely some things, but there's not, I don't feel confident like I don't know, and I can't readily think, even though there's people I can call who know some pieces that so forth, but not some real answer, some real strategy, like you just got to do it and you'll get there. So that's daunting, but it's also makes it interesting that you have to search and still find things elsewhere, but also make your own way. But it's definitely a change, because there was a period that it wasn't on our agenda as community organizing as much in the 70s and 80s, and now it's we think it's front and center.
Is that just true of your operations here in Massachusetts, or is that increasingly how PICO is looking at the world as well? Or?
I think so. Though not everyone, we had a
Sure.
national organizers meeting, and we had a caucus around jobs, and maybe a third of the organizers went to it and a third didn't, because it's not their top issue. They might be working on healthcare, they might be working on criminal justice, kind of pipeline to prison criminal justice
Sure.
issues and so forth. So or immigration. And obviously, sometimes immigration incrementally could build your base to enable you to do additional things on jobs too, but not everyone, but definitely more than it used to, is my experience.
Certainly, you know, back to the, you know, ULU days here and
Yeah.
whatever, we sort of ended up crossing that Rubicon in 1980,
Right.
you know, going forward, just in the shock of coming out of the 70s where we used to refer every job problem. And this may have been partly because our base was in the South where unions were even weaker earlier than they were up here.
Right.
You kept telling your members, call your union, here's, you know, theoretically who's got that jurisdiction, and gradually they keep coming back to meetings. Nobody answers the phone, and,
Right.
and you know, later on you realize, oh really, they don't have organizing departments in unions. We thought they, you know, sort of our naivete,
Right.
but then you sort of jump in the water and start organizing workers directly, and oh my God, then you find out how little really is out
Right.
there, and how little you knew, and how much you have to learn, and 30 years later,
Right.
raise the shirt and show the scars, but
Right. 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 And Wade and the people with them really, you know, broke a lot of that ground here in America.
But I'm delighted to hear you're on the minimum wage issue, because that's, I mean, we have to have, I mean, and with ACORN not able and active in the U.S., the whole need for the same kind of statewide
Mhm.
referenda that we did on minimum
Yeah.
wages and citywide efforts. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do that over again.
Right.
Once again, in the second Democratic administration, where there hasn't been a, I mean, Clinton waited to the last year to raise the minimum wage on the Fair Labor Standards Act, and Obama, I haven't seen anything about a minimum wage increase from.
Right. Right.
And it'll be the last year he's in before he starts talking about it, unless
Right.
we start indexing that
Right.
damn stuff.
Right. Yeah, and it's happening, like Missouri is a little bit counter to the earlier discussion. Missouri, the PICO affiliate, the Gamaliel affiliate, and the unions and the former ACORN affiliate that has a new name are together working on putting the minimum wage on the ballot and putting a payday lending referendum on the ballot. So that's a good story about
Yeah.
people working together across some of these lines. Is that it doesn't happen everywhere, but at least it's happening in some places in a common sense good way.
You know, it's important to demonstrate good practices, or best practices, you were saying. Yeah.
Yes.
Earlier you were talking about how, you know, there's more of a separation between the unions and community organizations than there was before.
He actually said there's
Yeah,
less.
it's the opposite.
Oh,
There's less
Oh my
now than there
God.
used to be.
My question.
Yeah, we're just like,
well, scratch that then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So like Mike Gallagher, who spoke to you in
Yeah.
the '70s, he was a community organizer like Wade and I. And then
Yeah.
if we thought about labor, the people who worked for labor unions were people we hardly knew and didn't really want to have much to do with us because they saw us as more radical or
And we were.
different background and so culture. But now someone like Mike, after doing some of this work that Wade did, where they created an independent union, has been in the labor movement for a long time, and him and other generation of people like Peter Ryder, who's an officer in this union, or people who used to be community organizers, are now running these significant labor unions. So it's in that way it's different. Whereas in the '70s into the '80s, it was sort of like two worlds. Now. The cultures are still can be different and so forth, but at least it's not the kinds of people going from one place to it being community organizing, going to unions or vice versa happens much more readily the last 10 to 15 years.
And that's particularly true in the service sector, where you have lower income workers, which has been key constituency for community organizations. I mean, construction unions are still, the labor movement would be in better shape in the United States and Canada, but just allow the construction unions to have their own union and then about, differently, because it just sort of pulls the labor movement backwards. And that's probably less true in Massachusetts, but in the rest of the world, they are just, still terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Questions? Alex?
I was just wondering, on the jobs front, when you're talking about wages and job training, I was wondering if any organizations that you're aware of are actually pushing for more direct kind of Keynesian kind of approach to actually the government directly creating jobs, or if that's just way high in the sky, given all the sort of current in the opposite direction now.
There wasn't. There was a little bit of an effort to think about it when what was called the stimulus package was being thought of in right after Obama was elected in the early part of his administration, but it sort of didn't get a reception. And then about 6 months into his administration, when there was talk of thinking about a second stimulus package, then people tried to raise it again, but not enough groups worked on it. It didn't get it got a pretty cold reception from the Obama administration, and even except the most progressive people, so it never got anywhere, and it's sort of and we're at the loss. It's just in the Depression, when our population is about a third of it was today. We put 3 million people to work within the first year in terms of in public work. The WPA and those kind of things. In my neighborhood, I have a park 2 blocks from my house that has a wall that was built by a park wall, this beautiful, wall that can stand, that was built by the WPA. And, my father had a job in the working on highway, doing highway in the 1930s. So 3 million people, that would be if we just did 3 million, let alone if we did the population of 9 million people,
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't even close. No. So it was thought about and raised, and some meetings were held, but just didn't. And bills were, some bills were introduced by very, very liberal Congress people, but it never really was seriously moved, because some of it is just the division, the context, and that Obama is cautious in a number of areas. Mm-hmm. But God, that's what we need, because we're talking, unless you put people back to work and put more money into the economy through that and raising minimum wages and so forth, we'll just be stuck in a sort of a long-term, not good economy. So it's the right thinking. But maybe in some of your NDP places, you may be able to
lead the way.
Lead the way.
Come on,
BC.
build some new models. BC.
Right.
On that, will you? Come on, John.
The chant they come into with the last convention was BC.
All right.
That's the joke there.
That's right.
It's a small joke, but
right.
I don't want to leave him out of it.
The bigger joke was the actual chant. That was the real joke.
That's right.
But
here they might think you go to Boston College if you say BC.
That's why we only use it up there in Canada.
how many? So you have statewide stuff with the PICO network and you're the.
I'm
what
the
do they
director.
call you?
I'm the director of. We have a name for our statewide entity, which is Massachusetts Communities Action Network, and then we have affiliates that are also PICO affiliates that we helped form over the years, like groups that have names like Brockton Interfaith Community and United Interfaith Action of Fall River, New Bedford, and Worcester Interfaith, and Essex County Community Organization. And so
you guys have all met up and say you want to work on the minimum wage statewide?
Well, our groups, yes, our leaders and our organizers have, met and sort of said that, made a decision that that's what we want to do on. But because we're not powerful enough as just a network, network community organizations, we're also went and met with the SIU leaders. We met with the president of the state, what's called the Massachusetts AFL-CIO, the state federation, because we see it's important that some of them want to do this so that there'd be a coalition that has them. And some of these things may, both their membership and leadership and money would be important. So we're not strong enough to do it ourselves, but we want to contribute seriously, and we want to, bring the issue up in places that may not otherwise have been thinking about it.
Is Lisa Clausen still doing a program that's with the
Community Labor United?
With the Boston?
No, she used to run a thing called the Community Labor United.
I know when she left us, she went to do that.
Right, which was a coalition of community groups and some unions in the greater Boston area that worked on some organizing projects. She left that and took a year off to be with her kids. She just went back to work for a union called Local 26, which is part of hotel and restaurant workers, and Unite here, the old Unite textile union, and so she's there. She just started there about 2 months ago.
As an organizer.
As an organizer, yeah.
Interesting.
So
Good
they have and like one of unfortunately or fortunately, we're going to be building casinos in Massachusetts. So that's one of their issues, that they want to organize the casino workers, because in their strongest local in the country is in Nevada, where they've
Yeah,
organized a
226,
big
yeah,
percentage
yeah,
of
right.
casino workers in Las Vegas.
Right. Oh, well, interesting.
But they do other, they represent a lot of a good percentage of the hotels.
And did that coalition survive, that little?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's still,
Somebody else took over.
Yeah, they're working kind of right now, focusing on like trying to get funding for transportation, because there's a deficit for the transit authority here and in other parts of the state. So that's probably that's the main issue they're working on.